for the semester. We have one more coming up on April 22nd, and that's going to be Forrest Fleischman talking about Ryan. Topic?
Forrest Fleischman.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I apologize. I didn't have the topic in my head for that one. Forrest Fleischman is going to be talking about some of his work on well, he works with like social issues related to forestry, correct? So he's going to be talking about some of those things. Originally for today, we had planned on a panel discussion related to historic forestry, which we've been able to maintain in the agenda today, historic forestry. But that panel discussion, the planning for it got a little bit shoved aside with all the hiring seminars in March. It was difficult for people to participate and do the legwork ahead of time. So Alan has been generous enough to step up and provide a talk that he had given before on historic forestry and forest inventories in the state of Minnesota. Alan Eck needs very little introduction in this room, I think. He's been the past head of the department and served as a great advisor to me for the past 8 years or so. And
I've been here for more than a century.
And yeah, I know you haven't, Alan. You have not. Alan's been around a bit though. He's worked out in Oregon and up in Canada. Is that in Ottawa, Canada, Alan?
Sault Ste. Marie.
Sault Ste. Marie. And then after time came back here to serve as head of department for quite some time. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alan and his look at essential forest growth and change in Minnesota.
Thank you. A little bit of prelude to this. I've always been kind of a history nut, like to look at history from, what should we say, pre-written history to the present, every continent, all the wars, and in particularly in the last several decades, getting more into the history of forests around the world, but in particular Minnesota. And this is actually one of the fun things that I do. It doesn't really take a lot of money. It just takes some time and bumping around the library and talking to people. So this is some of my work during fun times. And this really started in the late 1980s, and then in the early 90s, I had a graduate student who's now at Colorado State who helped me put together the first part of it, and I've revisited it in the last several years. So it's really a history of the development of forests in Minnesota going back more than a century. And I owe my orientation to this in part to a couple of people and events. Years back, I ran into Bob Stone, who was the director of the Lake States Forest Experiment Station Forest Survey operation, which was the FIA of the last century. And he got me, he was an economist, and those people are always troublesome. And he started to ask me questions, and I just couldn't answer it. And I learned things from him like that Christmas trees are worth more per pound than pork bellies, and how many board feet go into a house, and a variety of things. He was always thinking in ways that I couldn't. And so I kind of latched on to the change in forest resources over time. And working a bit with the generic environmental impact statement study in the early 1990s, I was forced to dig a little deeper and to try to be more quantitative. And that understanding has made me, let's see, what am I? I'm no longer a biometrician. I'm a resource analyst. And a resource analyst is somebody that can do whatever they want, and in particular look at how things change over time. And most of us start out relatively, what should I say, relatively narrow, and due to funding issues and so forth, we have a hard time really looking way back and looking way forward. We're really looking at what's around us. So this is a look a little bit back, and perhaps stimulating to some of you. I have a degree background in survey design, biometrics, and even silviculture. I got a couple of A's in silviculture classes, so I'm dangerous in that area too. So what I want to talk about is if I were to put it on one page, it's really, Minnesota has a long history of not only forest change, but measuring forest change. And we have instructive records of human activity, in particular since the early 1800s and statewide. We had forest surveys beginning in the 1930s. These have been repeated regularly. A look at these records suggests there have been a number of changes for a number of different reasons. The changes have been substantial. Brings up questions about biodiversity, health, habitat, management, investment, public safety in the long term. And that's really why I will walk through some of this today. And in the process, I'll try a few comparisons on other states and maybe even countries. So if we look quickly at Minnesota's history, and I gave you a copy of handouts, there's a few more up front here. There's so many numbers in here, I just didn't want, on the third slide, you have already forgotten the second one. I just soon give you something to take home. So we know that in the 1820s, we were running a small government sawmill at St. Anthony Falls. And actually that wood kind of, as I understand, it probably came from north of Anoka on the Rum River, White Pine and so forth. And that's what built the fort. There weren't too many trees around the fort back then. 1830s, we got the first commercial sawmill at Marina on the St. Croix, about 10-15 miles north of Stillwater. By the 1840s, we were a territory then, and we have some survey numbers, censuses from the U.S. Census and from the Census of Agriculture, both which go back to the 1780s or 90s in terms of their start. So we have some data. Supposedly then we had, in 1850, we aren't sure about the 1840s, except that we got some new sawmills, we had a population of 6,077 people. And the U.S. Census then is really pretty good, and if you're into diversity, it lists where people came from, immigrant status, and what countries and where, whites, free blacks, Native Americans. We were into that detail right from the start of the country. And as you go farther, especially near the Civil War and after the Civil War, you see a lot of people stuff in the surveys and in the Census of Agriculture, which was kind of a survey visiting periodically roughly every 10 years, every little farm. How many pigs do you have? How many chickens? How many bushels of this did you produce this year? Do you have apple trees? Do you have a woodlot? Is that woodlot improved? How many cows do you have? We have that data by farm, by county, going back to the late 1700s. There's a lot to work with there. It's fun to look at. 6,000 people, not real crowded, 157 farms. Now, if I bounce ahead from 1850, 50 years later, we have not 157, but 154,000 farms. Tremendous change. And these farms occupied maybe 30 acres less than 30,000 acres less than a township, and now 26 million acres and a spare 1,000 small sawmills around. It's a lot of change reflected on the landscape. 1862, big year, that was the railroads reached Minnesota, and James J. Hill, if you ever visited his mansion in downtown St. Paul, he was starting to really rake it in, doing fine. 1862 was also the land grant legislation, the Morrill Act, and also the Continental Railroad authorization. So 1862 was a really big year. Right after the Civil War, we had a tremendous economic boom with a few ups and downs all the way to 1900. First paper mills in Minnesota, the first one that, I think the first ones used mostly fabric, cloth, so forth. And by the 1890s, we had pulp mills in Minnesota, several of them. 1876, people were thinking about those forests, Minnesota Forestry Association was established. Again, these were boom times. You went from a population of 6,000, and by 1900, you had 1.7 million in Minnesota, so tremendous change. In the 1890s, we had things like the Hinckley Fire, and then we'll have a couple of surveys, forest surveys in the 1890s I'll talk about. And in 1899, we had the peak timber harvest in Minnesota. I think the harvest nowadays is right around, if you count fuel, it's probably around 3 million cords a year. We harvested 7 million cords in 1899. And if you look at the US, for example, we went from a population of 5 million in 1800 to 75 million in 1900. Just tremendous rate of growth. We get into this century, we have the Hinckley Fire, we have the World War I in 1914, starting a lot of chaos. The Roaring 20s, so to speak, which were an economic boom time. Lammo hit by a depression in the 30s. Civilian Conservation Corps dealt with primarily unemployment, but they planted a lot of trees and built a lot of park buildings along the way. And 1936, which I'll talk about a bit, was the first really well-organized statewide forest survey. We talk about FIA today and all of its databases and how handy it is to use. That was the first one. And a number of our early faculty were associated with that survey, either in analysis or in the field work. Anybody here as an undergrad was awarded the Lawson Scholarship. Well, Lawson was a crew leader on the 1936 Forest Survey. It was tough. World War II, wood was a really big deal. We actually had projects going on here on how to make a better propeller, how to make aircraft out of plywood, and a number of aircraft were made out of plywood. We had PT boats built out of plywood. World War II was a major utilization period, big post-war recovery. A lot of things happened in the 50s and 60s, and the first Earth Day, 1970s. We see the kind of birth or rewording of forestry around the term ecological forestry in the 1990s. And it was a funny period. The federal government was very happy to announce ecologically oriented forestry for political reasons. A lot of the forestry schools were not happy. They said, we were teaching ecological forestry all along. Where have you guys been? And anyway, they sorted that out, and it's a common term today. And we had our economic downturn, 2008 and 9, and here we are starting out at 6,000 and ending up, today I think it's 5.6 million people in Minnesota are residing here. You think that's had an impact on our landscape? Yeah, you can believe it. We can also go back a little further when President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark west. He sent Colonel Pike, this is the Pikes Peak guy in Colorado, sent him up the Mississippi in 1803 to 1805 to find the source. And near my cabin up by Aiken, he talked about, you can read his diaries are not as detailed and scientific as Lewis and Clark, but they really tell the local scene. So he's camped about 3 miles from my cabin in 1804. He describes that as scattered oak and pine and buffalo and elk. So kind of an open forest. And I should say, I like history and I like art. One of the things I do in looking at the history of forests is to look at artwork. So I'm in DC, or I looked at a lot of paintings in Europe. And some people are walking around looking at the people in the paintings. I'm looking at the background. And you can actually learn quite a bit about the slash and burn agriculture of the times in the 16 and 1700s as well as the battles and so forth that were going on. Well, we've produced some history, Marshner's map. There's a lot of history behind that, and I think Lee is here, right? Oh, okay. Lee's probably more familiar with it than I am, Lee Freilich. And Marshner never really visited Minnesota, as I recall, but he was really a very astute map maker, and that led to, from the data from the land survey, public land survey across Minnesota, 1847 to 1907, he drew then this basic original, so to speak, vegetation map of Minnesota, which we found very useful even today. Here's a map, an example produced in the 1962 statewide forest survey. A bit less work went into that, but it gives you a sense of where the major forest types are. And today we have all kinds of tools to make all kinds of maps. Not necessarily better, but we have more colors available today. So if we talk about the history of Minnesota's forest, associated with Marshner's work is the idea, although I've never been able to find just where it was calculated, the idea that we started out with about 30.5 million acres of forest, about a third of the state, or the state is about 55 million acres, and 30.5 million were originally forest. I've actually found a few sources like this history of forestry in Minnesota from 1929 that talks about 38 million. So I found 2 citations for 38 million, quite a few for 30.5. I don't know which is right. I'm still kind of looking for who really said it first and how they got to that. I'm not sure we'll ever know. But at this period, they're describing our forests here as really the big woods that's around here in southeastern Minnesota, extended from the mouth of the Crow Ring River, south to the boundary of the state and west to the prairies. And this was the hardwood forest with a scattering of pine. And who took down this forest, so to speak? It was really settlers who took it down and created largely farmland out of that. Whereas the northern forest going north along the Mississippi and towards Duluth and farther north, that was what they called the Northwoods, where pine and spruce were major items. And that really was, what should we say, taken down by the crush for lumber. So 2 different social means of taking advantage of those forest resources. We had some interesting DNR divisions back then, the Commissioner of Forestry and Fire Prevention, and General Andrews Nursery up by Willow River is named after him, and he was really the first fire warden, which was really the first state forester, and I'll come back to some of what he accomplished. So here's our forest acreage as we look at it today, and looking back, we're up about 17.7 million acres of forest. Timberland is a little bit less. You have to exclude the reserved area and the unproductive areas, and you arrive at the light gray bar. That's what would be called commercially available, although the term does vary with the economy. And in terms of forest area, you can see we had a downturn in the earlier part of the century. And then if you follow this back, and I've worked to make my best guesses as to what these numbers were. 36, we know we had a survey. 1913, I have some rough numbers on that, and I kind of guessed this, and that takes you back to the 30.5 million. So that's the history of Minnesota's forests in one graph. Interestingly, the forest area, though it's declining in the western part of the state still, It is rising slightly in the north. People just don't live there anymore. When I was a kid, I used to, and this is part of the old war stories here. My brother and I were so bored going on fishing trips that we would count cows between, say, Grand Rapids and International Falls. And way back when we would count, I'd have the one side of the car and he'd have the other, and we'd count 1,500 cows between Grand Rapids and International Falls. I took that same route maybe 15 years ago. I counted one moose. That's the difference in the disappearance of a lot of small farms that really developed. Today, you won't see the barns. Back in the 60s, you could see the barns. And similarly, along the North Shore between Duluth and, let's say, Silver Bay or whatever, it was all small farms. We could see the lake everywhere. Now we're cutting vistas through that so we can see the lake. So even in one person's time, you can see quite a bit of change. The per acre thing is more interesting because we've been fixed on the idea of what that old forest looked like. We do know, and I put this in cords per acre because a pickup truck with a pile of wood in the back is about 1/3 of a cord, and a cord is 4 by 4 by 8, and a piled wood with about 79 or 80 cubic feet of wood in that cord, so people can envision what a cord is. Whereas if I talk about millions of board feet or tons of biomass, you know, I just see the eyes go, huh? So this is where we are today, about 14 cords per acre. If somebody asked me as a resource analyst, you know, what's the average volume of timber in Minnesota, I just go, you know, it's about 14 cords an acre. And I've done that in several other states. It's worked out, and people have even paid me to do that. So we see this an increase since '77 in the volume per acre of Minnesota's forests, which is an indication of how full they are. Much less in '62, much less in '36. And then actually we found some numbers of 1895 that suggest it was 13 or 14 cords per acre. And what happened, we had a tremendous exploitation of that resource, which ended in the late 20s, early 30s. And this is the area where, if you're looking back at old pictures of uncle or grandfather or whatever, and they're sitting next to their 1930 Model A, and there's a shotgun laying there and about 200 dead pheasants on the hood. That was fantastic habitat time for pheasants and related birds, and you can just see it in the old family pictures. So this forest really got whacked off after taking 7 million cords out of here, and actually something like, I think it was 75 million cords or more since the 1840s came out of Minnesota. That wouldn't have been half bad if they didn't take half the acreage and turn it into a farm. Anyway, so the line for harvest comes down to the early 1930s and then starts going back up because the forest is recovering. Today we harvest about 3 million cords a year, and we've been harvesting 3 million cords a year, plus or minus a couple 100,000, since the let's say 1940s. It's just very feasible to do that, and the forest is still there, in fact, filling up, so to speak. We'll come back to this 1936 one because that was the first forest survey, and talk about a difficult effort. But to compare this back to, here's 1936, and these are the volume per acres of the different cover types, And oaks are pretty good volumes per acre, just not that much oak acreage then. The conifers were much more productive in terms of particularly board feet and the ability to build, as they eventually did. Built most of the houses in Minneapolis and St. Paul out of white pine that came out of the northern forest. and 20 cords per acre on the average for white pine. That's about 5,000 board feet per acre. We have some stands at Cloquet that are roughly 25 to 35,000 board feet per acre. So this is on the average for the forest type, young stuff and old stuff, as we get it from the 1936 Forest Survey. Interestingly, here we'll go back to just a large area. General Andrews asked the state auditors in about 1895, will you guys go out and check the remaining natural forest? Go out and find it and find out for your county how much of that natural forest there is and how much of what is in there. And he came up with then a report from 23 different counties, mostly northern counties, in terms of an average volume per acre for this remaining natural forest. And I'm guessing the really best natural forest have been harvested. So some of these numbers, especially for pines, might have been higher, because we know some of those acreages were 50 or 1,000 board feet per acre. That's if you're in a park area in the Cloquet Forestry Center and you see the big pines all bunched together, the fire tower stand, that's about 40,000 board feet per acre now. At one time it might have been 50. And if you look at how this adds up, and again, this is the average across almost 11 million acres, comes out to that 13.95 cords per acre. So we kind of know what those forests look like. If we had to talk about valuable stuff then, white pine and to a lesser extent red pine were very valuable, white pine especially, and the next most valuable thing was cedar. We did not have a treating wood capability up until the 1940s. And cedar was, the 1936 survey spends a lot of time talking about cedar and how important it is and what you can make out of it and so forth. So cedar was a big deal. Today, not so much. And if we look at the size class change, here's 2017. Our forest has grown back to 17 million acres. In 1936, we had a bit more acreage, but we had this funny thing that they couldn't figure out what to call it. Just looked like cut over forest. They were pretty sure that 4.123 million acres was going to turn into forest, but they didn't know what to call it. So they just called it brushland. And sure enough, by the 1960s, most of that had come back to forest. But I can just imagine, you know, hey Joe, what do we call that thing? I mean, that's just a mess over there. That was a major early survey problem. And if you look at this, here's a very young forest. Most of the trees are small, most of the ages are young. And today we have a forest that's really dominated 10 million acres of medium to large size stuff, only 6 million acres of small stuff. So we don't have a balanced age class distribution. That keeps changing, and that's one of the major areas that we try to manage forests with.
So Alan, on that bushland note, did they plant that in the 1930s?
No, that brushland was not subject to planting, and in fact, they hadn't really seen much effect from the CCC then in planting. This was what you found when you went out, and stuff had been cut over, and a lot of the leftovers were burned. I mean, back then, if they gave you a harvest number, you probably had to add a third to it to get up to firewood levels. No, the planting really didn't show then. And in fact, I shouldn't say that. There are, in this set of records here from General Andrews' time, there is a note about acreage that was planted and acreage that was planted to a few exotic species. So they were trying to make something out of it. And Sam Green, after Green Hall, was already out there working with General Andrews and running experiments to try to see how we grow white pine and red pine better, faster. So here's our harvest, this 7 million cords up here in 1899, dropped pretty fast to the mid-1930s, then climbed up, and today it's right about here. And we've been doing that for decades. Let's see, what else can I say from this? Interesting, although I was involved in the generic environmental impact statement on timber harvesting and forest management in the 1990s, and I knew Bob Stone well, who actually wrote the 1966 report, I never saw the paragraph in there where he says, you know, we're growing wood so fast now that we really ought to up the harvest level to about 4 million cords or more. I mean, I never, how could I miss that? And we had this generic environmental impact statement that suggested 4 million cords as a base. We just about hit 4 million cords in right around the year 2000, and it dropped off, and the economic downturn brought us down to 2.6 or 2.8, maybe a little bit more today. And that GEIS had scenarios for 4 million cords, roughly 5, and 7, which turned out to have some feasibility issues based on the analysis assumptions. Okay, so you can try me on a question at any time. So if we talk about the more policy-oriented history, we see the first forest protection and conservation ideas about in the 1870s. Actually, John Muir visited Minnesota back in the 1890s, talked to Sam Green, and can't remember, Charles Schenck, who was the guy who started the Biltmore First School of Forestry down in South Carolina. And so General Andrews and Sam Green were kind of a forestry mafia together with a few legislators that made a lot of things happen. But we see the beginning of these ideas in that period and consideration of habitat. And we see from the 1890s on quite a bit of development in the organization around forestry and what today is the Department of Natural Resources, the Pollution Control Agency, and a number of environmental related entities. So that really began there with a relatively small number of people pushing pretty hard. I once asked Dean Scope, who was the dean here for a number of years, I said, how did those guys get so much done back then? I mean, how come they were able to pass this and that and whatever else and make changes? And he said, well, there just weren't too many rules then. You could get away with it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Beginning in the 1930s, 1936, we had regular surveys of forest resources condition and practices roughly every 10 years, and now we're into a annual forest survey that covers 1/5 of the plots in the state, maybe 6,000 plots, 1/5 of those every year, and every 5 years we get a kind of a summary report. So our analysis and planning capability is much greater today than it was back then. But I wanted to get into a little bit of detail because this takes you a little bit into the silviculture and how we actually manage these forests. So this is what keeps a resource analyst awake at night, unless they have substantial libations to go along with it. Here's our 15.9, basically 16 million acres of timberland. The other roughly 2 million acres is really reserved or unproductive. like in the boundary waters or the black spruce swamps in parts of northern Minnesota. Those aren't really going to be touched for anything other than windstorms. And the resource analyst will break this up and say, how many acres of this 15 million do you have in this age class versus the next one? And these are two 10-year classes in blue, and then we move to 20-year classes. And this is what you might call the older stuff. And we have seen this distribution then move. And just to talk about the simplest kind of thing is you have 1.5 million acres that are in the 10 to 20 year age class. If you're going to continue that through time in 10 years, this is going to move to that, but there's not enough of this to match that. So you're going to have less going forward. This is going to move this way, this is going to move that way, and as the forest ages, we've seen then an increasing paucity of acreage in these younger age classes, with a few exceptions. But we could take red pine, important commercial species. In 10 years, this 58 is going to be replaced by only 32, and this 192 is going to be replaced by this plus that, which would be, or not all of that, substantially less red pine going forward in this age class. You might satisfy this one for a while, but as you take these numbers forward, from 10-year class to 10-year class, or from 20 to 20, you end up with a substantially different marketplace capability. And of course, the forester's dream age class distribution is the same number of acres in each age class. I mean, that's the classic. We don't have that, never really had that. Probably the closest we come to it is aspen, because we've managed aspen more than anything else. And so these numbers going forward are probably more stable than certainly red pine. If you look at northern white cedar, there isn't any young stuff, which isn't going to be helpful then as you move into these older age classes. Fortunately, cedar lives so long that it's less of a problem than it first appears. It's either more of a problem or less of a problem, depending on how you want to look at it. So we don't have that, and supposedly much of forest management training is geared to smoothing out these age classes. And there are a number of harvest scheduling strategies that can help you do that, either for the purpose of habitat or economics. And certainly in terms of habitat, this is a very important age class. I mean, anybody who hunts deer or grouse knows that that's the most important age class for aspen and white-tailed deer or rough grouse. Some of these others are less clear. White pine, we've been trying to plant more of it and thin away the hardwoods to make more of it. And it's going to be a long time before we grow that distribution. If you look at our capability, annually, we harvest about 1% of the acreage, which is our management capability. Harvest this and turn it back into something here. Windstorms blow over more than that. And we have a little bit of fire, and we have insect and diseases. So the natural disturbances are larger than our capability almost to manage anything. And so that's the harvest scheduling dilemma or forest management dilemma. What treatments, including harvest, might you employ to even these things out to give us something you might call sustainability? I mean, the biggest thing about sustainability is how many acres do you have in that age class? So we're maintaining forest, 17 million acres. We're just not maintaining the cover type distribution and the economic and habitat capabilities that would suggest we should go after. So this is, if you're a silviculturist, pick your cover type, consider what might happen. And doing nothing isn't really much of an option. You just make a difficult situation more difficult. So what we see here, if we kind of summarize this, we've got this rise and fall of cover types and acreage. Should cause us to ponder the focus for harvest, regeneration, silvicultural treatments, needs for improving productivity, health, resilience. Older forests are typically much less healthy than younger ones. They blow over easier than young ones. Resilience is a key feature. You want some kind of species mix. How much do you really want? I've had some consultants tell me about Minnesota's biodiversity problem. We're looking at economic development and jobs in Minnesota, and I've been told a number of times that, the problem you guys have is you have too much diversity. We really need, for any kind of a large scale industry to function, you need 1 million or 2 acres of something. We have 4 or 5 million acres of aspen and not enough of anything else to really make much of a market out of. Yeah, you guys have too much diversity here. Okay? And you really are up against areas like a number of southern states have 20 million acres of loblolly pine, tremendous industry, or a number of million acres of Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest. Aspen is the only one that we have a lot of. The next one might be northern hardwoods across the 3 states. So diversity is one thing. Habitat might be another one. And this idea of economic capabilities is another way to look at it. So there are environmental, economic, and social benefits. And so what are the implications for no management? You get what you get. It's difficult to move this state to consider the economic benefits because we're so, this is personal opinion, how can you tell? Because of our fixation of having almost everything living on every acre. And so the economics is a little trickier. So how do we compare in providing benefits? The 3 lake states, Michigan's always had a bit more of a forest economy. Henry Ford bought a bunch of land back in the 20s to build, to be able to create the wood parts of Model Ts and Model As. And then since then, we've kind of moved away from that. Michigan's been more active in economics. Wisconsin is a little faster organized than Minnesota. Georgia and South Carolina are recruiting industry and trying to bring capabilities back. They're just putting a tremendous amount of effort in it. I mean, we look like we're working this hard and they look like they're working that hard, and they're actually pretty effective at it. So we can learn a lot by looking at these other states. Colorado is an example of a state that took such good care of its forest resources that it ran virtually all of its industry out of the state. And now their main source of activity in forests is fire. They burn the place down. The harvest in Minnesota, I said, was maybe 3 million cords a year. In Colorado, it's 200,000. And yet they have quite a bit more forest acreage than we have. And if we looked at other countries, the Nordic countries are shorter seasons, less productive lands, and they grow and market at least 3 times as much per acre as we do. So North America is, we've always been such a large economy that we have a hard time concentrating on any one part of it. Whereas in smaller countries that really have to scramble with the resources they have. I remember one Finnish forest manager telling me, we don't have coal, we don't have oil, we got wood, we got to make something out of that. And we don't really have that emphasis in this country. So my last question for you is simply this. Will we do what we have done in the past and kind of watch this happen? Or will we study up and actually address the issues and the opportunities as they come by? So I leave you with that question, and I know the answer probably to any question you'd ask me, so feel free. I mean to get in this a little bit farther now that I have more time, particularly in the using the census of agriculture to get at the forest land acreage back in the 1800s. We have some rough numbers, and as farms developed, they went from having, first they called them farms, and then they separated improved farms, improved acreage compared to unimproved acreage, and then by the 1850s they moved to including woodlot acreage, and later on improved woodlot acreage. So you can almost track part of that change in forest area by looking at the census of agriculture. Not perfectly, but in some ways more effectively than we have. And I'm still digging for the 38 million acre citation, $10 prize for a strawberry sundae if you can find it. And I left you a last page on that handout, which are really some of the sources that have come my way that are fun to read. Cunningham and Mosier in March in 1938, really impressive resource analysts. Back then there were only two kinds of foresters. There were those that measured things and those that figured out the economics. Later on, forest wildlife was added, and today we have many specialties. Back then they were just people with pretty good heads who worked on trying to figure out what these resources look like and what that means. So Cunningham and Mosier, that's a great report, and Stone, 1966, my old hunting partner. He always knew where the birds were, and he was a luckier shot than I was. I mean, who can shoot one of the antlers off a 12-point buck? I mean, isn't that skill? And anyway, and you can see some of the dates on these, and almost all of these can be found in our library. So it's a fun area to dig in. You don't have to worry about anybody getting a big grant and beating you to it. Nobody has, and so any questions you might have would be just fine.
Alan, looking back at slide 12 where you have the cover type by age class table. So I know you dealt with this back in the late 80s, early 90s about cover type change through time. So how does an aspen forest, how much of that aspen forest that's in the 40 to 60 moving into that 61 to 80 versus typing over into something else, northern hardwoods or possibly balsam poplar or birch or whatever? Who's doing work in that area? Do we have fairly good cover type change information on a temporal scale?
We have some of it in the sense of David Wilson has been digging into the 5 and 10 year change in the FIA survey. So if you make, and there is one recent Minnesota Forestry research note that takes what it was 5 years ago and what it is today in terms of the cover type change matrix. And generally about 14% of plots in a cover type, these plots cover a good share of an acre, change to some other cover type within 5 years. So if you're thinking of how fast change occurs, 14%, or let's say 86% in 5 years is still there. 86 or 0.86 times 0.86, how much of that is left in 10 years and in 20 years? And you find that if you go 20 years, you don't know where anything is anymore. I mean, we know what a jack pine stand looks like, we just aren't sure where it is. The exception might be spruce in that nothing else seems to want to grow in those bogs. So we are developing that, and back in the 60s there were some attempts to develop diagrams of how things move, like various kinds of hardwoods to more sugar maple and so forth. And they were nice diagrams, except they didn't work when you looked at the actual dynamics of a landscape, which is much less predictable. I mean, you kind of know where all the parts went, but in any 5-year period, the silviculture changes, there are big blowdowns, there's a variety of things, and so 14% is likely to be somewhere else later.
So Helen, here's a question related to, most of this was done on the ground. How much is being done with either satellites or drones that you could be able to identify the forest type with satellites and then follow it over 10, 20, or every year, I guess?
Well,
Is that work being done, or is that?
there's work on that. It's really very difficult. If this were, I used to work doing some of this for the Canadian Forestry Service. If you're working in Ontario with 6 species, this is pretty easy. If you're working on this in Minnesota with 15 species, very hard. We really have made almost no progress, regardless of the imagery that we have used. So let's say 30 years ago, on very good color aerial photography and good stereoscope, and somebody who was skilled, we could get about 75% of the cover type labels right, 3/4 of them right on a good day. And if it was white pine or black spruce, probably better. If it was aspen, we couldn't tell it from birch, and we still can't tell it from birch. So that area of research is promising, but it's very difficult to pull it off, and I don't think it's going to be pulled off very soon. If those of you who have been in forest inventory, you've probably been out on a plot with somebody else, and you'd say, you know, is this spruce or is this fir or is this aspen? You're looking right at it. You can't really decide. So Minnesota has maybe 20% of its cover types are really pure, really maple, sugar maple, really aspen, 80% aspen. We have a lot of acres that have 6 different species on them, and that shows up in the inventory. So it's very difficult to classify our forests. If I was in Finland, the job's already done. There's only 3 species, and there's 6 or 7 age classes. I could almost do that in my sleep. Yeah. So big area, major cost savings. And if you, just to scare you, if you were going to, FIA spends about $5-6 million every 5 years to get our statewide inventory done over a period of 5 years. Let's say $6 million for this, for the state of Minnesota, at about $10 an acre. Let's see, even $6 or $7 an acre to conduct their forest inventories, where they map things and identify what's on the ground and so forth. That's the state of Minnesota would need $30-40 million to do that. It's really hard to get those kinds of monies to do that, which is why the emphasis on trying to do this with remote sensing. So that's, oh, yeah.
I've always wondered, comparing like an acre of corn to an acre of forest for timber. Can you give me a sense of, is farming corn much more profitable?
The market system is set up so it's annually far more attractive, yes.
Annually?
Yes, and so not only a bushel sells What's a bushel now, Mike, $5? So a bushel of corn, get 100 bushels an acre. Pretty soon that adds up to real money, and then you get that annually, whereas with forests, you might get in Minnesota a couple $1,000s an acre every 10 to 20 years. So good question.
Just wondering what your thoughts are on the forest industry and innovation. Like what has been, I mean, when I look at your long timeline, you see things like, well, sawmill, pulp mill,
Yeah.
and that's what we've got today. You compare us to maybe other agronomy or agriculture and things that are going on there. What do you see as the role of innovation in this story that you're telling? Is there a role for innovation, or are we in need of innovation if we're going to move the needle on some of this stuff?
The demand overall is going up, but now it's a global marketplace. We are really competing with Scotland, which has a lot of new forest, with South America, whatever. And if you look at the companies in Minnesota, a number of them really have their headquarters in New York or Amsterdam or some other part of the world. So it's a global competitive picture, except for local stuff. You know, if you go into just even Menards or Lowe's or whatever, you see a lot of new products made out of wood. You may not be able to tell they were made out of wood, but a lot of the plastics are made out of wood. Parts of cell phones and so forth. But it's going to be hard to engineer our way into a lot of new products other than the cellulosic area, or maybe what do we call it? The plastics you can engineer out of wood that, well, actually, I mean, you've got car fenders made out of wood nowadays and things like that. But it's hard to get as big a marketplace as when we were building society and building everybody's house and everybody's factory. So I think it's going to be slow. The thing about forestry is it's less politically organized than agriculture. It really has a hard time. If you go over to the legislature in the spring, you'll see on a nice sunny day 200 people wearing seed hats from the farm. I used to be a farm kid, so I kind of remember that. And you might see somebody with a forestry hat if you're lucky. I mean, our 10 million small landowners nationally is not that set up with political clout to make that much difference, and the economics of it long-term versus short-term. But I think we can do much better than we are. I would say the principal problem in Minnesota in terms of stimulating our natural resource-based industry is the environmental review area of our state economy compared to other states. I mean, we make it much harder, almost impossible for new forest industry in Minnesota than does North Carolina or Georgia or even Michigan. And so if I get a little bit more political, we have become more of a flyover state for investments in natural resources compared to Michigan or compared to these other states. And so we become so protective of our environment that we just don't want to disturb any of it, and we subtly work very hard unknowingly at times to block capability to move in. I mean, not that I want to mine next door or whatever, but when it takes you 10, 15 years to get to approve a new mine, or 5 to 7 years to approve a pipeline, you kind of know it's difficult in that state. Whereas I could bring a new plywood plant into South Carolina and have it all signed, sealed, and delivered in 3 months. So Minnesota is a tough state in terms of environmental review, but it's not well understood. Yeah.
About that, what's your opinion on the sustainable timber harvest analysis that the DNR has been doing?
Well, it's good that they did one. I mean, they really went to the effort to formulate it, and I think it's instructive. There's a number of things I would change about it going forward, in that assumptions about the stability of cover types is pretty strong, when in fact things change faster. Even when they get done with that set of harvest levels, we will still have a very old forest. In other words, we're not really moving enough of these acres to a younger age class to make much difference. So you might say, if I was talking to the Deer Hunters Association, just renewed my membership, I would tell them that you need to push the DNR to harvest more if you want to harvest more deer. Similarly with grouse. But it's a very difficult environment in the agencies to get that kind of work done. But I would give them real credit for working on that idea. Well, thank you very much. That's fun. I just pull this out, or I should go to.
Yeah, it's